G'day everyone. It might come as a shock to many of you, but I've never owned or reviewed an Omega timepiece. A small part is due to a lack of interest, but the main reason is the price. So once again, Steeldive step up to the plate and provide a similar offering, but for almost 1% the cost of its luxury counterpart. So let's steel ourselves, dive in, and review this 1957 model. So here are the specs, including the case diameter and other measurements, weight, water resistance, movement, and price. And being an AliExpress watch, always shop around and gather up your coins and coupons to get the best price. And straight off the bat, there's two things that'll strike you about the 1957. The first and most obvious is its similarity in dial and case design to the Omega Seamaster. The second and more unique element is the use of a dull yellow, orangey, brown Fauxtina on the hands, indices, and bezel markings, which I'll mention later. But checking out the 1957, at the dial edge you have the minute track running around it, with slightly thicker rectangles at every 5-minute interval. At a casual glance, they look pretty straightforward, but up close they separate every 5-minute track position and link the other 4 with an underline. It helps to pronounce those 5-minute marks and gives a bit of visual interest. Positioned below these thicker tracks are loomed applied circular indices and single rectangles positioned at the 3, 6 and 9 points, and a double rectangle up at 12 o'clock. Moving further in and below the 12 indice, you have the Steeldive text and logo, and above the 6th position running down in 3 lines you have the automatic text, followed by water resistance in meters and feet, and the broad arrow symbol below. I'll leave a link in the description if anyone wants to learn more about its meaning. But this section of text uses a font style that's appropriate for this type of watch and is the right size. Legible but not overbearing. The sword-shaped skeletonized hands have a lot of visual appeal. You don't see these hand types every day in a diver's watch, but what I love about them is how different they are from each other, with the hour hand using a lubed circular pip and an almost complete hexagon on the end, and the minute hand using a more familiar triangle pointer. Rounding out their appeal is the loom along the hand edges, a very attractive proposition for the lumophiles out there. And rounding out the hands is a second hand with a lollipop balance on the end, and a touch of red on the pointer to add a dash of colour. Although with the black dial background and darker indices, it won't always grab your attention. But one particular point of interest with that dial is that it actually has more of a grey hue, but you'll only see it in the light. Otherwise you'd think it's a plain black dial, an element I quite like and appreciate. The bezel is loomed, and I really appreciate how they've managed to utilise the available surface space to provide maximum legibility and detail, thanks to the stretched effect of those numerals in the minute track. On first glance and feel, it's very smooth, but once your fingers grab the edges, it's deceptively grippy and turns without much difficulty. I suspect it has something to do with the deeper grooves on the side. You can hear a bit of tinniness when you're turning it, but it's perfectly fine at its price point, especially when you also consider there's hardly any backplay too. And dare I say it, this is probably the best bezel I've ever operated on an AliExpress watch, and still better than some more expensive offerings. Fitting with the tool watch aesthetic, the case sides have a brush finish that don't appear to have any imperfections. The exception is the more polished finish on top of those lugs, and true to Omega homage and acting as a main attraction, they are twisted. I'm uncertain if they offer any benefits over traditional lugs, but from a visual standpoint, they do give the 1957 more visual pizzazz. And best of all, the lug ends have almost no sharpness to them. The cyan screw-down crown is well protected by its guards and thankfully has just enough clearance and knurling to make gripping and operating a straightforward task. The crown itself feels sturdy in fingers when adjusting the time, and un- and rethreading the crown isn't complicated or fiddly. A handy trait if you're wearing this in rotation with other watches. The brushed, screw-down case back is adorned front and center with the Steeldive logo, along with its specifications running around the circumference. By now you'll probably know how I feel about that logo, but I'm learning to make peace with it and just accept it. On the plus side, that screw-down case adds to the 1957's water resistance, and for layers retching on that case, it looks and feels pretty deep, so it shouldn't wear off in a hurry. And in spite of the slightly bulkier dimensions of the 1957, Steeldive have kept the lug width to 20mm. Thankfully it doesn't make its appearance look ungainly or gawky, and best of all you won't have a problem sourcing a replacement strap if you want to change it up. And unlike the Omega Seamaster, the 1957 forgoes the inclusion of a helium escape valve, but still advertises a water resistance rating of 300 meters. I know in my previous review of its 1953 stablemate, I mentioned I had mixed feelings about this, given neither of these watches have an ISO certification. But after reading about other people's experiences with their own Steeldive models and how they've held up to their own water torture tests, I'm inclined to say this inclusion is a positive. But let me know in the comments below if you've soaked the Steeldive and how it held up. And funnily enough, that comment leads me to my own mixed feelings about the 1957, and kicking this off is the engineer bracelet. For the most part, it's more of a positive experience. It's got some heft, but it feels sturdy, there's very little rattle, has a milled clasp that's also got a decent laser etching of the Steeldive name and logo, solid end links, and includes 6 micro adjustments to help find that perfect fit. 2 minor nitpicks include a rather stiff keeper that makes it a little harder to undo and redo, and despite my best fitting abilities, a tendency to nip hairs on occasion. It also uses push pins to hold the links in, but again, for this price, that's expected. The bigger nitpick is that it uses male end links. The dimensions of the 1957 are already a bit on the larger side, but with the bracelet, it pushes the lug width out to just under 54mm. But if that's a problem, at least sourcing a replacement strap will be a simple task. Circling back to those dimensions, the case diameter and lug width are a little on the larger side, but bracelet aside, it's still suitable for those with medium to larger size wrists. But with a case height of 15.5mm, it is definitely on the tall side, and you won't be fitting this under a shirt sleeve comfortably. Also keep this in mind if you like to wear NATO straps. Additionally, at 186 grams, you'll definitely feel the 1957's presence on your wrist. So if you don't like to be reminded that you're wearing a watch, this might not be for you. But given the watch alone weighs 91 grams, you could, again, just swap the bracelet for a strap. The use of the NH35 movement in a watch at this price point makes a lot of sense, and is still great value. But given the absence of a date complication on the dial, aka the ghost date, this might be a source of annoyance for some. Similarly, the absence of a date window gives the 1957 a very uniform appearance, but that also sacrifices the benefit of being able to check the date. And let's move into the negatives. The good news is that I only have 2 to mention. Bad news is that they're pretty significant. The biggest drawback to the 1957 for me is that Fauxtina. And if you recall the title of this video, I mentioned it was Fauxtina well done. But by that, I mean they really overcooked it. I understand Fauxtina is a love or hate feature amongst many enthusiasts, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But compared to similarly themed watches, the contrast is way too much. I feel the Fauxtina should have been done with a bit more subtlety, or better yet, Steeldive should have just kept the homage theme going and excluded it, because this also leads to its detriment in another feature, the loom. When you get it going in a dark room, those skeletonized hands look super cool, almost like the hand ends are being suspended on wires. But this pleasure is pretty short-lived as the loom fades out way too quickly on the hands, and the dial and bezel follow suit not long afterwards. Against my Seiko, it offers absolutely no competition. The second negative of a 1957 isn't the biggest, but it's the one that annoyed me the most, and that's its anti-reflective coating, or complete absence of. Normally I can tolerate a bit of reflection on the crystal, but I feel Steeldive should have put a lot more effort in here. Even with indoor settings, you still get a fair bit of reflection, but in direct sunlight you can almost forget about any legibility proposition. When you've got really nice and prominent hands and indices on that dial to check out, it's a bit frustrating having to adjust your wrist or move locations to read them properly. As a bonus nitpick, the Steeldive logo is still too large on the dial. And it's those 2 major negative traits that stopped me from recommending the 1957, which is a shame because otherwise I really like this design, even if it is a homage, and some of its other features, including the bezel and crown action, are on point. If they just made the Fauxtina a bit rarer, like the Addies dive I reviewed earlier, or just gave it a miss and added a few layers of AR coating, this would be an easy recommendation to those looking for a more bold dive watch, or the Omega experience on the cheap. But until that day comes, I'd hold off or look elsewhere. If you own or have owned a Steeldive 1957, I'd like to hear thoughts about it. But that's it for now, and thanks for watching, eh?